The convent bells would ring at dawn, and Sister Mary Catherine knew she had less than 3 hours to decide whether to take her final vows or lose her soul entirely. She knelt in the chapel, rosary beads cutting into her palms, tears streaming down her face as she begged God for a sign, any sign, that the path she'd chosen at 16, desperate and orphaned, was truly hers, and not just the only door open to a girl with nowhere else to go. The wooden pew creaked behind her. She turned, expecting Mother Superior, but instead found a tall cowboy with dust on his boots and a hat in his hands, looking as out of place in the sacred space as a wolf in a henhouse. Before we continue, I'd love to ask you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Your support truly matters and motivates us to bring you more quality stories like this one. I'd also love to know, where are you listening from today? "Forgive me, sister," he said, his voice low and rough as desert wind. "I'm looking for sanctuary. Men are after me." Catherine's breath caught. She should call for help, alert the Mother Superior, protect the sanctity of this place. Instead, I killed a man who tried to force himself on a woman in Dodge City. His brother's the sheriff. Law says I'm guilty of murder. God might see it different. Catherine stood, years of obedience warring with something deeper, something that had been whispering to her heart for months. "The cellar," she said quickly. "Follow me." She led him through the darkened corridors, past sleeping sisters, down stone steps worn smooth by decades of faithful feet. The cellar smelled of earth and stored vegetables, cool and hidden from the world above. "You're bleeding badly," she said, lighting a small lamp. In its glow, she could see the wound in his side, the pallor of his face. Without thinking, she reached for the hem of her habit. "Sister, you don't have to. My name is Catherine." She met his eyes. "Just Catherine, and you're going to die if someone doesn't tend that wound." His name was John Mercer, and over the next 2 hours, as she cleaned and stitched his wound with steady hands that had learned healing from the convent's infirmary, he told her about his ranch outside Tombstone, about the sister he'd saved, about the life he'd been building before one moment of necessary violence sent him running. "You're good at this," he said through gritted teeth as she pulled another stitch tight. "Go slow. It hurts." "I'll die before I hurt you more than necessary," Catherine replied, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. "But you need to stay still." "You don't seem like the other nuns here," John observed, watching her face in the lamplight. Catherine's hands paused. "That's because I'm not sure I am one. Not really. Not in my heart." The confession tumbled out, words she'd never spoken aloud. "I came here when I was 16. My parents died of cholera, and I had nowhere to go. The church offered safety, purpose. I thought it was a calling. But now," he prompted gently. "Now I'm supposed to take my final vows at dawn, and I feel like I'm about to lock myself in a prison for life." She tied off the last stitch, her fingers trembling. "There, you should heal if infection doesn't set in." John caught her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, and the touch sent electricity through her entire body. "Catherine, not sister, just Catherine." He said her name like a prayer. "You don't seem like a woman who should be locked away from the world. You seem like someone who should be living in it." The bells would ring in less than 2 hours. Above them, footsteps echoed. "Sister Mary Catherine," Mother Superior's voice called out. "The sheriff's men are here. They're searching for someone." Catherine's eyes met John's. In that moment, she saw her entire life split into two paths. One leading to the altar where she'd kneel and give up herself forever. The other leading, where? Into darkness, into danger, into the unknown. But with this man, who looked at her like she was a person, not a vessel for someone else's salvation. "We'll run before the bells ring," Catherine whispered, making a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff and growing wings at the same time. John nodded and took her hand. Together? Together. They waited until Mother Superior's footsteps faded. Then Catherine led John through a passage she'd discovered months ago during her long, restless nights. A gap in the foundation that opened into the ravine behind the convent. She'd never imagined she'd use it for escape. "I have nothing," she said as they emerged into the cool pre-dawn air. "No money, no clothes except this habit, no skills except prayer and healing." John helped her down the rocky slope, his wounded side making him wince, but not slowing him down. "You have yourself. That's more than most people ever really possess." His horse was hidden in a grove of cottonwoods, a big bay gelding who nickered softly at their approach. John swung into the saddle, then reached down for Catherine. She'd never ridden a horse before, never been this close to a man, never felt the solid warmth of a male body as John pulled her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling his heartbeat under her palms. "Hold tight," he said. "We've got hard riding ahead." They rode through the darkness as the sky began to lighten behind them, putting miles between themselves and the convent. Catherine didn't look back. She kept her face pressed against John's shoulder, breathing in the scent of leather and sweat and something wild that made her feel more awake than she'd been in years. When the sun rose fully, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, they stopped at a creek to water the horse and rest. Catherine's legs were shaking from the unaccustomed riding, her hands stiff from gripping so tight. "You all right?" John asked, helping her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist, steadying her. "I don't know what I am," Catherine admitted. "Free, terrified, alive." She laughed, a sound caught between joy and panic. "I just abandoned everything I've known for the past 9 years for a man I met 3 hours ago. I must be insane." "Or brave." John cupped her face in his rough hands, his touch impossibly gentle. "Catherine, I won't lie to you. My life right now is dangerous. I'm wanted for a killing, even if it was righteous. I don't know where we'll end up or what tomorrow brings, but I look at you, and I see a woman who should never have been locked away. I see someone worth any risk." "I see the same in you," she whispered. "A good man who did what was right, even knowing the cost." They stared at each other as the sun climbed higher, and Catherine realized she was standing in the desert in a nun's habit with a wanted man. And it was the first morning of her entire life where she'd woken up to a day that was truly her own to choose. The kiss, when it came, was soft and questioning, John giving her every chance to pull away. But Catherine leaned into it instead, her first kiss at 25 years old, and it tasted like freedom and fear and coming home all at once. They rode hard for 3 days, staying off main trails, sleeping under stars that Catherine had only glimpsed from convent windows. John taught her to ride properly, to read the land, to move quietly. Each night, they sat by their small fire and traded pieces of their pasts. His ranch that was probably lost now. Her parents who'd loved books and laughter. The people they'd been before circumstances forced them into other shapes. "I never wanted to take a life," John said on the third night, poking at the fire with a stick. But when I saw that man hurting Sarah, his sister, my ranch hand's daughter, something in me just acted. I didn't think. I just moved. You protected someone who couldn't protect herself, Catherine said firmly. That's not murder. That's justice. The law doesn't see it that way. Then the law is wrong. She moved closer to him, close enough to feel his warmth. John, where are we going? There's a town across the border in New Mexico territory. Small place called Cimarron. Friend of mine is the deputy there. Honest man named Martinez. He might be able to help clear my name. Or at least hide us until things cool down. He turned to look at her, firelight dancing in his eyes. But Catherine, I need you to understand what you're getting into. Life with me won't be prayers and peace. It'll be hard work, uncertainty, maybe danger. Life at the convent was dying by inches, Catherine replied. I'll take hard work and uncertainty over that slow death any day. She reached out and traced the scar on his jaw, a white line she'd been curious about since the beginning. Tell me about this. Rattlesnake, when I was 12, spooked my horse and I fell wrong. He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. Tell me about your dreams, the ones you had before the convent. No one had ever asked her that. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. I wanted to be a teacher. My mother taught me to read and love books, and I thought I could help other children discover that same magic. But when she died, there was no money for normal school, and the convent was my only option. Cimarron needs a teacher, John said quietly. The miners' kids run wild because there's no school. If we make it there, if we build a life, you could teach, Catherine. You could have that dream. The possibility bloomed in her chest like a flower after rain. Do you mean that? I don't make promises I can't keep. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, listening to his heartbeat. You're not property. You're not the church's possession or bound to vows you made when you had no other choice. You're a person with worth and dreams, and the right to choose your own path. I choose this, Catherine whispered. I choose you. I choose us. That night, they didn't just sit by the fire. They lay together under John's bedroll, arms wrapped around each other, and Catherine learned that intimacy wasn't just physical. It was trust, vulnerability, the courage to let someone see you completely. When John kissed her again, deeper this time, she felt the walls she'd built around herself begin to crumble. We should wait, he murmured against her lips. Do this properly. A wedding, a home. I've waited 9 years. Catherine interrupted, running her fingers through his dark hair. I'm not waiting anymore. But I want to be alive, John. I want to feel everything I've been denied. They made love slowly, carefully, John constantly checking that she was all right, that she wanted this, that he wasn't hurting her. It was awkward and sweet, and nothing like the cold warnings about sin she'd heard in the convent. It was human and beautiful, and made her feel more connected to God than any prayer ever had. Afterward, lying in his arms under a sky full of stars, Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks. Did I hurt you? John asked immediately, concern thick in his voice. No, she laughed through her tears. You made me feel alive for the first time in my life. These are happy tears. Together, he murmured, kissing her forehead. Whatever comes, we face it together. They reached Cimarron 6 days after leaving the convent. Dusty and weary, but still standing. The town was exactly as John described, rough and small, perched in a valley with mountains rising behind it like protective walls. Deputy Martinez, a weathered man with kind eyes and a magnificent mustache, listened to John's story in his small office while Catherine waited nervously outside. The brother dropped the charges, Martinez finally said, and Catherine heard it through the open window. Her heart leapt. Turns out several witnesses came forward, said it was clear self-defense and defense of the girl. Sheriff didn't want to pursue it once public opinion turned. "You're a free man, John." Catherine burst through the door, and John caught her, spinning her around as she laughed with relief. "Free," she breathed. "You're free." "Free," he corrected, setting her down but not letting go. "Both of us." They were married the next week in a small church, but it was nothing like the solemn ceremonies Catherine had witnessed in the convent. This was joy. Martinez and his wife as witnesses, the local priest who asked no questions about the nun's habit Catherine had burned in their campfire, the simple gold ring John bought with the last of his money. "I, Catherine Ann Walsh, take you, John Patrick Mercer." Her voice was strong and sure. No vows forced by circumstance this time. This was choice, pure and simple. John's ranch was still his. His foreman had kept it running, loyal, despite the accusations. But Catherine didn't want to go back there, to the place John had fled from. Instead, they used what little savings he had left to build a small house at the edge of Cimarron, close to where the creek ran clear and cold. Catherine opened her school in the front room of their home. 8 students the first day, miners' children who'd never held a book before, their eyes wide with wonder as she read to them. By the end of the month, she had 15 students, and the miners' wives had taken up a collection to buy her proper textbooks from Santa Fe. John worked as a ranch hand for Martinez's cousin. Honest work that paid enough to keep them fed. At night, he came home to Catherine, and they built a life together one day at a time, cooking meals, tending a small garden, making love in their own bed in their own home, talking about dreams and plans and the children they might have someday. 6 months after they'd fled the convent together, Catherine stood in her schoolroom doorway, watching her students practice their letters. John rode up, dismounted, and came to stand beside her. "Happy?" he asked, sliding an arm around her waist. Catherine leaned into him, thinking about the girl who'd knelt in that chapel, terrified and trapped, begging for a sign. She thought about the bells that had rung that morning without her there to hear them, continuing on as if she'd never existed. She thought about the life she'd almost accepted, the slow death of self she'd almost chosen. "I'm alive," she said, turning to kiss him. "For the first time in my life, I'm completely, wonderfully alive." Behind them, her students giggled at their teacher kissing her husband. Catherine laughed and pulled away, blushing but unashamed. She'd spent years being told that love between a man and woman was something to fear, something impure. But standing here in the doorway of her school, with her husband beside her and her students learning to read, Catherine knew the truth. Love wasn't a sin. Caging love, denying choice, forcing people into boxes they didn't fit, that was the real transgression. The bells had rung without her that morning, and the world had kept turning. But somewhere in the darkness before dawn, a young woman had chosen herself, and in doing so, had found everything she'd ever needed. "We'll run before the bells ring," she'd whispered in that cellar. And they had, straight into the life they were always meant to live. 5 years later, Catherine stood in front of the territorial governor, accepting an award for her school's achievements. 23 students now, with 2 other teachers working alongside her. Her own son, 3 years old, with his father's eyes and his mother's determination, sat in the front row with John, both of them grinning with pride. "Mrs. Mercer," the governor said, "they tell me you were once destined for the religious life." Catherine smiled, her hand finding John's across the small space between them. "I found my calling," she said simply, "just not the one I expected." That night, after their son was asleep and the house was quiet, John held her close in their bed. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, a question he'd asked before and would probably ask again. Leaving everything behind? Catherine thought about it, really thought about it, as she always did. She thought about the safety of the convent, the certainty of routine, the simplicity of surrendered choice. Then she thought about this life. Messy, uncertain, challenging, beautiful, entirely her own. "Not for a single second," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "You saved my life that night, John. But more than that, you helped me save myself." "You're the one who chose to run," he reminded her, as he always did. "And you're the one who gave me something worth running toward." She kissed him deeply, still feeling that spark of electricity that had been there from the first touch. Together. Always together, John agreed, and they held each other through the night. Two people who'd found freedom in the most unlikely of places and built something real from the ashes of their old lives. The convent bells had stopped ringing for Catherine that dawn, but her heart had started beating its own rhythm, and it was a song far sweeter than any she'd sung in that chapel, the song of a life lived fully, chosen freely, and loved completely. 7 years had passed since Catherine had run from the convent, and their life in Cimarron had taken root like the cottonwoods along the creek, deep and strong. But prosperity brought its own dangers, and Catherine was about to learn that some shadows from the past refused to stay buried. She was teaching arithmetic to her oldest students when the stranger appeared in her schoolroom doorway. Tall, dressed in black, with a Roman collar that made Catherine's heart stop cold. "Sister Mary Catherine," Father Thomas O'Brien said, his voice smooth as oil. "Or should I say, Mrs. Mercer? I've come a very long way to find you." Catherine's students went silent, sensing the tension that suddenly filled the room like smoke. She stood slowly, placing herself between the priest and her children. "Father O'Brien, what brings you to Cimarron?" "Your immortal soul, my child." He stepped into the room uninvited, his eyes sweeping over the primers and slates with evident disapproval. "You took vows before God. Those vows are eternal, unbreakable. The Church has been searching for you since the morning you vanished." Catherine felt ice in her veins, but she kept her voice steady. "I took vows as a frightened 16-year-old girl with nowhere else to go. Those vows weren't made freely, Father. They were made out of desperation. The reasons don't matter. What matters is that you are still bound to the Church, still consecrated to God. Your marriage is invalid in the eyes of Rome. You're living in sin," his gaze hardened, "and teaching children while living in mortal sin. Surely you see the problem." Before Catherine could respond, John appeared in the doorway behind the priest. His expression was calm, but Catherine knew him well enough to see the barely contained fury in his eyes. "You need to leave," John said quietly. "Now." Father O'Brien turned, taking in John's size and evident strength, but didn't back down. "This woman belongs to the Church. She must return to the convent and do penance for her sins. If she refuses, I'll have no choice but to inform the territorial authorities that she's violated sacred vows. Her teaching certificate will be revoked, her marriage annulled." "My marriage is legal," Catherine said, finding her voice. "I never took final vows, Father. The ceremony was scheduled for dawn, but I left before it could take place." You took temporary vows that bind you until the church releases you. You never sought that release. Therefore, you remain under canon law." He pulled papers from his coat. "I have a writ here from the Archbishop demanding your return." Catherine felt the world tilting. Could they really do this? Could the church reach across 7 years and 3 territories to drag her back into a cage? "Students, classes dismissed early today," she said, keeping her voice calm despite the panic clawing at her chest. "Go straight home and tell your parents. We'll resume tomorrow." The children filed out quickly, casting worried glances back at their teacher. When they were gone, Catherine faced the priest fully. "I won't go back," she said firmly. "I've built a life here. I have a husband, a son, students who need me. I'm doing more good here than I ever did behind convent walls." "Good works don't excuse broken vows," Father O'Brien replied. "You will return with me to face the Mother Superior and accept your penance, or I will ensure that your life here is destroyed. The church has powerful friends, Mrs. Mercer. You cannot hide from God's judgment." John stepped forward, placing himself between Catherine and the priest. "She's not hiding, she's living, and you need to leave before I forget that you're a man of God, and remember only that you're threatening my wife." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Father O'Brien's eyes. He backed toward the door. "You have 3 days to consider your position, Sister Mary Catherine. After that, I'll take action. The church always wins in the end." He left, his black coat swirling like crow's wings. Catherine's knees buckled, and John caught her, holding her tight as she shook. "He can't do this," she whispered. "He can't take everything we've built." "He won't," John promised, but she heard the worry in his voice. "We'll find a way." That night, they sat with Deputy Martinez and his wife Rosa in the couple's small kitchen, laying out the problem. Martinez rubbed his face wearily. "The church has influence, there's no denying that," he said. "But Catherine, you said you never took final vows. The ceremony was scheduled for dawn. I left with John maybe 2 hours before." "Then legally, you're not bound," Rosa said firmly. She'd been a midwife before marrying Martinez and knew her share of church politics. "Temporary vows expire if not renewed with final profession. If you left before that ceremony, you're free." "But the Archbishop's writ is intimidation," Martinez interrupted. "I'll send a telegram to Santa Fe tomorrow. Check with the territorial attorney." But I think Rosa's right. Without proof of final vows, Father O'Brien is bluffing. Still, Catherine couldn't shake the dread that had settled in her bones. That night, she held John tight in their bed, listening to their son's soft breathing from the next room. "What if they're wrong?" she whispered. "What if the church can prove I'm bound to them? What if they take our son away, say he's illegitimate?" "Catherine," John tilted her face up to his. "Look at me. I won't let that happen. I'll take you and Thomas, and we'll run again if we have to. Canada, Mexico, wherever we need to go. I found you once in that convent cellar. I'll keep finding you, keep protecting you, as many times as it takes." "I don't want to run anymore," Catherine said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I want to stand and fight. This is our home. These are our people. I'm not the scared girl I was 7 years ago." "Then we fight," John said simply. "Together." The next 2 days were tense. Father O'Brien took a room at the town's only boarding house and made a point of being visible, talking to merchants, chatting with miners' wives, subtly undermining Catherine's reputation with carefully placed doubts about her moral character. Some people were swayed. 3 sets of parents pulled their children from Catherine's school. Others, most thankfully, stood firm, Rosa Martinez organized a meeting of the mothers, and they came to Catherine's house en masse. "We don't care what some priest says," declared Sarah Chen, whose daughter had learned to read under Catherine's patient instruction. "You've given our children something precious. That's what matters." "The church doesn't own you," added Maria Rodriguez, a widow with 5 children. "Nobody owns you but yourself." Their support fortified Catherine, but she knew the real battle was still coming. On the 3rd day, Father O'Brien returned to her schoolhouse with 2 serious-looking men, a territorial marshal and a lawyer from Santa Fe. "Mrs. Mercer," the lawyer said, "I'm afraid there are serious questions about the validity of your marriage and your fitness to teach. The church has presented documentation." "Which I've reviewed," Deputy Martinez interrupted, striding into the room with papers of his own. Behind him came John, and behind John came what seemed like half the town. Miners, ranchers, shop owners, mothers with their children, and which I've had verified by the territorial attorney. Mrs. Mercer never completed her final vows. Her temporary vows expired 7 years ago when she failed to renew them. Under territorial law, her marriage to John Mercer is completely legal and valid. The lawyer's expression shifted from confident to uncertain. He glanced at the papers Martinez held out. "Furthermore," Martinez continued, "Mrs. Mercer's teaching certificate was issued by the territory of New Mexico, not the Catholic Church. Unless you have evidence of actual wrongdoing, which you don't, you have no grounds to revoke it." Father O'Brien's face had gone red. "The spiritual matter remains, is between Mrs. Mercer and God," Martinez finished, "not between Mrs. Mercer and you. This is a territory governed by American law. Father, not canon law. You've been given your answer. It's time for you to leave." The crowd murmured agreement, and Catherine felt John's hand find hers, his grip strong and steady. The lawyer studied the papers for another moment, then sighed and turned to Father O'Brien. "He's right. We have no case here, Father. I'm sorry, but the church's position isn't supported by territorial law." Father O'Brien looked at Catherine with something between pity and fury. "You're damning yourself, woman. You've chosen earthly pleasures over eternal salvation." Catherine met his eyes without flinching. "I've chosen life over slow death, love over fear. If God judges me for that, I'll accept his judgment, but I won't accept yours." The priest left that afternoon, his face dark with defeat. The town celebrated that night, an impromptu gathering at the saloon that spilled out into the street, with music and dancing and toasts to Catherine's courage. But Catherine herself felt strangely hollow. She stood apart from the celebration, watching her neighbors rejoice, feeling John's arm around her waist. "You did it," he said quietly. "You faced them down." "We did it," she corrected. "All of us." She looked up at him, tears in her eyes that weren't quite sadness or joy, but something in between. "But John, what he said about damnation, what if he's right? What if I've put my soul at risk?" John cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "Catherine, listen to me. The God I believe in doesn't want his children locked in cages. He doesn't want love punished or freedom condemned. If the church can't see that, then the church is wrong, not you." "I used to be so sure of everything," Catherine whispered. "In the convent, everything was black and white, right and wrong. But now you're living in the real world, where nothing is simple, and faith has to be more than obedience." John kissed her forehead. "You're not damned, Catherine. You're brave. You're good. You're exactly who you're meant to be." She leaned into him, letting his certainty anchor her. Around them, the celebration continued. Deputy Martinez dancing with Rosa, their son Thomas running with the other children, her students' parents raising glasses in her honor. "I do have faith," Catherine said, slowly, working it out as she spoke. "Just not the kind they taught me. I have faith that love is sacred, that choosing your own path is holy, that teaching children to read and think is God's work, even if it's not done in a convent." She looked up at John. "I have faith in us." "That's enough," John said. "That's more than enough." The territorial attorney's official letter arrived a week later, confirming everything Martinez had said. Catherine's marriage was legal. Her teaching position was secure. The church had no claim on her. She should have felt relief, joy, triumph. Instead, she felt complicated. That night, she sat at her desk writing a letter by lamplight, with John reading in their bed nearby. "Who are you writing to?" he asked. Catherine hesitated. "Mother Superior, at the convent." John set down his book. "Why?" "Because I need to say goodbye properly. I ran away in the dark, and I never explained, never gave her any peace about what happened to me. She was not kind exactly, but not cruel either. She deserves to know I'm alive and well." She wrote carefully, choosing each word with precision. "Dear Mother Superior, 7 years ago, I left the convent before taking my final vows. I know my disappearance must have caused concern and perhaps scandal. I want you to know that I am safe, married, and teaching school in New Mexico territory. I have a son and a good life. I don't expect you to approve of my choices. I don't even know if I fully approve of them myself some days. But I know they were mine to make, and that matters more than I can express. I thank you for giving a frightened orphan girl shelter when she had nowhere else to go. But I'm grateful even more that God gave me the courage to leave when I realized that shelter had become a cage. I pray you are well, and that the convent continues its work. But I also pray that if another young woman comes to you desperate and afraid, you might help her find her own path, not just the path the church has laid out. With respect, Catherine Ann Mercer, formerly Sister Mary Catherine." She sealed the letter and gave it to John to post the next day. She never received a reply, but she hadn't expected one. The act of writing it was enough, a closing of a door that had been left hanging open for too long. Life settled back into its rhythm. Catherine's school grew. John took on more responsibilities at the ranch, eventually becoming foreman when Martinez's cousin retired. Their son, Thomas, started showing his mother's love of learning and his father's quiet strength. But the confrontation with Father O'Brien had changed something in Catherine. She began attending church again. Not the Catholic Church, but the small Methodist congregation that met in the schoolhouse on Sundays. She'd been avoiding organized religion since leaving the convent, afraid of being pulled back into that rigid structure. But she missed the community, the ritual, the sense of connection to something larger than herself. The Methodist minister, Reverend Sarah Blake, a woman which still startled Catherine sometimes, welcomed her warmly. "I heard about your troubles with the Catholic priest," Reverend Blake said over tea one afternoon. "That must have been difficult." "It made me question everything I thought I believed," Catherine admitted. "I'm still working through it." "Good," Reverend Blake said, surprising her. "Faith that's never questioned isn't faith, it's just obedience." Real faith requires wrestling with doubt, with fear, with the hard questions. God is big enough to handle our uncertainty. Catherine felt something unknot in her chest. I was taught that doubt was sin. Doubt is the door that leads to deeper understanding. The sin would be refusing to walk through it. The Reverend smiled. You're welcome here, Catherine. Not because you have all the answers, but because you are willing to keep asking the questions. For the first time since running from the convent, Catherine felt like she could breathe fully in a church. This wasn't about rules and guilt and fear. It was about community, growth, the messy business of being human and trying to do good in the world. She started helping with the Sunday school, teaching the youngest children, and found that she could talk about God again without feeling like she was being strangled. She could sing hymns without remembering the bells. She could pray without feeling like she was betraying herself. John watched this transformation with quiet support. He'd been raised Baptist but hadn't been religious in years. Still, he came with her on Sundays, holding Thomas in his lap during the service, squeezing Catherine's hand during the hymns. "You seem happier," he observed one Sunday afternoon as they walked home through the autumn sunshine. "I think I'm finally figuring out who I am," Catherine said. "Not who the convent wanted me to be. Not who I thought I had to be to make leaving worth it. Just me. Catherine, woman, wife, mother, teacher, person of faith." She laughed. "It's complicated." "You're worth the complication," John said, pulling her close for a kiss that made Thomas squeal, Papa, in mock outrage. That winter brought the worst snowstorm Cimarron had seen in a decade. The school had to close for 2 weeks, and families were snowed in, struggling to keep warm and fed. Catherine and John opened their home to 3 families whose cabins weren't equipped for such severe weather. It was chaos. 14 people in a house built for 3. Children everywhere, supplies running low. But it was also beautiful. Catherine taught the children during the day, while the adults worked to keep everyone fed and warm. John and the other men took turns breaking trail to the nearest ranch for supplies. At night, they all gathered around the fire, telling stories and singing songs, finding comfort in community. One of the women, a young widow named Alice, confided in Catherine late one night when the others were asleep. "I used to judge you," Alice admitted quietly. "When Father O'Brien came and said those things about you leaving the convent, I thought maybe you were, I don't know, morally weak or something. I'm sorry." Catherine smiled in the darkness. "I don't blame you. The Church teaches that obedience is the highest virtue. It's hard to break free from that thinking. But seeing you now, how you opened your home, how you teach, how you love your family, I realize that leaving the convent might have been the most moral thing you ever did. You're doing more good here than you ever could have done behind walls." Alice paused. "I lost my husband to a mining accident last year. Sometimes I think about just giving up, going back east to my parents, living as a dependent for the rest of my life. It would be easier than this constant struggle." "Easier isn't always better," Catherine said, thinking of her own choices. "But whatever you decide, make sure it's your choice, Alice. Not what's expected or what's convenient or what other people think you should do. Your choice." When the snow finally melted and life returned to normal, Alice decided to stay in Cimarron. She started a small dressmaking business, working from her cabin, building a life on her own terms. She and Catherine became close friends, 2 women who understood the courage it took to choose your own path in a world that wanted to choose it for you. Spring came, and with it, news from the outside world. The railroad was coming to Cimarron. The town would grow, change, become something different. Some people were excited. Others worried about losing the close-knit community they'd built. Catherine had mixed feelings. More people meant more students, which meant she'd need help with the school. But it also meant more complexity, more potential for conflict, more chance that someone from her past might appear. She was proven right when a letter arrived bearing familiar handwriting. Her hand trembled as she opened it. "Catherine, I hope this letter finds you well. I am Sister Beatrice. Do you remember me? We were novices together, all those years ago. I've recently left the convent myself. I followed a path similar to yours, though without the romance of running away with a cowboy. I simply realized, as you must have, that the life wasn't mine to live. Mother Superior gave me your letter before I left. She never responded, but she kept it. I think in her way, she understood. She told me that if I ever needed guidance, I should seek you out. I'm writing to ask if there might be work for me in Cimarron. I was educated by the nuns, and I can teach, keep accounts, do needlework. I'm not asking for charity, just a chance to start over, as you did. If you'd rather not risk your own reputation by associating with another runaway nun, I understand. But if there's room in your new world for someone like me, I would be grateful beyond words. With hope, Elizabeth Brennan, formerly Sister Beatrice." Catherine read the letter 3 times, emotion clogging her throat. She remembered Beatrice, Elizabeth, a bright, laughing girl who'd had that light slowly extinguished behind convent walls. To know she'd found the courage to leave, to start over, to reach out. She showed the letter to John that evening. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think you've been talking about needing help with the school," John said practically. "And I think you'd never forgive yourself if you didn't help someone else find the freedom you found." Catherine wrote back immediately, inviting Elizabeth to Cimarron. When the young woman arrived 6 weeks later, Catherine barely recognized her. Gone was the severe habit and downcast eyes. Elizabeth wore a simple traveling dress, her blonde hair pinned up, her face cautiously hopeful. They embraced on the train platform, 2 women who'd survived the same cage and come out the other side. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered. "Thank you for showing me it was possible." "Thank you for being brave enough to follow," Catherine replied. Elizabeth moved into a small room at Rosa Martinez's boarding house and began teaching the younger students while Catherine focused on the older ones. They made a good team, and the school flourished. By summer, they had 30 students and were talking about building a proper schoolhouse. The railroad arrived in August with noise and dust and transformation. Cimarron tripled in size within months. New businesses opened. New families arrived. The town built a proper church, hired a doctor, started a newspaper. Catherine's school became official, the Cimarron School for Young People, with her as headmistress and Elizabeth as her assistant. They hired a 3rd teacher, a young man from Denver named James, who taught mathematics and science. The territorial government granted them funding and supplies. John transitioned from ranch work to serving as town sheriff when Martinez retired, his reputation for fairness and courage making him the natural choice. Thomas started school alongside the other children, proud of his mother but not spoiled by her position. One evening, as Catherine watched the sunset from her porch, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From that desperate girl in the convent chapel to this woman with a full life, a loving family, a career that mattered. Father O'Brien had called her damned. The church had called her a sinner. But looking at her life, at the students she taught, the friends she'd helped save, the son she was raising, the husband she loved, Catherine knew the truth. She wasn't damned. She was blessed beyond measure. Not because everything was easy or perfect. There were still hard days, still doubts, still moments when she wondered if she'd made the right choices. But those choices had been hers, and that made all the difference. "Catherine," John called from inside, "Thomas wants you to read to him before bed." She smiled and went inside, into the warm glow of lamplight, into the life she'd chosen. The bells had stopped ringing for her long ago, but her heart kept singing its own song of freedom, love, and hard-won joy. And that was the only sound that mattered. 10 years after running from the convent, Catherine stood in the new schoolhouse, built with donations from grateful families and timber from John's ranch, and looked at the 47 students gathered for the end-of-year ceremony. 47 lives she was touching, shaping, opening to possibilities they might never have known without education. The territorial governor himself had come to present her with a Teaching Excellence Award. But as Catherine accepted the certificate, it wasn't the honor that moved her. It was seeing Elizabeth, now married to James, the mathematics teacher, beaming with pride. It was watching Thomas, 10 years old, and already showing signs of his father's quiet leadership, help organize the younger children. It was feeling John's steady presence in the back row, his eyes never leaving her face. "Mrs. Mercer," the governor said in his speech, "represents the very best of our territory. Courage, determination, and dedication to the next generation. When she arrived in Cimarron 10 years ago, she had nothing but a fierce belief in education and her own capabilities. Today, she has built something that will outlast all of us." After the ceremony, after the families had left and the schoolhouse was quiet, Catherine sat at her desk with John beside her. Through the window, she could see the mountains turning purple in the twilight, the same mountains that had watched her arrive dusty and desperate, running from one life toward another. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't hidden in that chapel?" John asked, as he sometimes did. "Every day," Catherine admitted. "I think about the woman I would have become if I'd taken those final vows, if I'd locked myself away for life. She would have been safe, secure, protected from all of this." She gestured at the world outside the window. "But she wouldn't have been me." "No," John agreed, "she wouldn't have." Catherine stood and moved to the window, John following. Together they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson and violet. "We'll run before the bells ring," Catherine said softly, remembering that desperate whisper in the darkness, the promise that had changed everything. John took her hand, just as he had that night, and we're still running, not away from anything anymore, toward everything that matters. Catherine smiled and leaned into him, into the strength and warmth and certainty of this life they'd built. The bells were silent now, had been silent for years. But somewhere in the distance, she could hear children laughing, horses neighing, life continuing in all its messy, beautiful, complicated glory. She'd chosen this. Every day for 10 years, she'd chosen this, and she would keep choosing it, over and over again, for as long as she drew breath. Because running toward freedom was the bravest thing she'd ever done. And freedom, it turned out, was the only place he'd ever truly belonged. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while working? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Catherine and John's journey? Your feedback means the world to us.